do I really believe that life in recovery can be better than life in addiction was? Or am I doing it just from a kind of defensive mindset of, I want to fix my marriage, I want to solve things, I want to placate my partner? Or is there that sense of, no, this is who I want to be, this is what I want to do?
But Chris, I'm going to start off with aha moment for you in your practice. What is, over doing this for the years, what is that connecting of the dots, that, big realization that you find that sex addicts in particular see that really transition them from one stage to the next where, long-term recovery really begins?
It's a great and obviously very important question. I think for me, when I think about this topic, the idea of internal versus external motivation is the primary thing that comes to mind. So when I see clients that do really well, there's that sense of an internal motivation to change. So what I really mean by that is most people originally come into some form of treatment or support because there's an external driver, an external motivation. My wife has discovered my behavior, or the police have knocked at my door, whatever it might be. And external motivation is very powerful. Oftentimes it's necessary in order to kind of get us on the path. But to me, there has to come that point where it's just starting to shift from external to internal. And a big part of that for me is, do I really believe that life in recovery can be better than life in addiction was? Or am I doing it just from a kind of defensive mindset of, I want to fix my marriage, I want to solve things, I want to placate my partner? Or is there that sense of, no, this is who I want to be, this is what I want to do, this is exciting, this is positive? So, it might be hard to feel that sometimes in amongst the kind of turmoil of recovery, but I think that's what comes up for me, internal motivation.
And that's perfect, because it bleeds right into what you and I talked about a couple of weeks ago about discussing today, which is, I think, and this will kind of transition into our topic, but you and I have taken some of the same training. And I think, when you really start examining some of those aspects of, I call it legacy. I mean, really, when you see the impact of your actions and your way of life from a sustainability standpoint, I think, at least for me with my clients, because they are high achievers, high performers, executives, entrepreneurs, I think they think a lot more about legacy, because a lot of them have accomplished a lot of what most people plan to accomplish in a lifetime. A lot of them have accomplished it usually in their 30s or 40s. And so then their focus kind of shifts to, all right, what am I going to do for the next 40 years of my life? And legacy was one of those of topics. And at least, for me in my recovery, I think that was what made me connect those dots that you're talking about. It was, is this sustainable? This practice, if every single man, let's just say, did viewed women in the way that I viewed women, what impact would this actually have on an extended period of time? And as a father of a 5-year-old daughter, that kind of hit me a bit different. I have a sister, I have a mom. And so to me, I'd like to start with going down that path of this, and the training that you and I share. There's this concept of sexuality being passed down from a generation to a generation. Speak to that for me. Do you follow my thought process there? So it's the connecting of the dots of, can I really keep doing, as much as my brain's trying to convince me that I'd like to keep doing this, is this actually a sustainable practice?
Yeah. And I guess it links to, for me, and tell me if I'm kind of going on the wrong track with this, but this idea of in addiction, so often we might think, I can kind of get away with this, I can compartmentalize this isn't necessarily going to impact my legacy, my children, my partner. And again, though, you've mentioned we've done some similar training, and we use this metaphor, maybe jumping right into it. So we're referring to the Minwalla model, or the DST model. And we use this kind of really powerful metaphor of the secret sexual basement. And so if you'll indulge me, I'll kind of briefly talk us through it. So you've got this idea of the family home. You've got, picture the stereotypical happy family home, couple of kids, the wife, the husband there, couple of cars on the driveway. But there's this secret sexual basement underneath the home, and only he knows about it. So the rest of the people living in that home have no idea it's there. So only he knows about it. And so we're really, with this metaphor, painting this idea of the two-part problem, where not only is it the sexual behavior itself, not only is it what's going on in the basement, it's the fact that he's hiding it from the rest of the family. If the trap door's shut, there's a lock on it, the rug's kind of rolled out over top of it. And so one way to think about this that I think links to what you're saying is, how are the fumes kind of escaping from that basement and poisoning or shaping the people above, even when maybe we think it's rock solid, it's watertight. And so I think there is a huge question there of legacy. And I think I take your point as well, that if a lot of people listening to this and watching this are people who have been very successful in various areas of life and are probably leaving very positive legacy in lots of different ways, this is maybe a new way of thinking about this issue as a legacy issue. And again, this is a whole other topic in itself, but healthy sexuality, or sexuality in general, is something where we live in a very sexualized society, but how often do we talk authentically about sexuality? Mm-hmm. And so the legacy we leave our children, I've got 2 daughters myself, for what it's worth. I think you mentioned having a daughter. That's a really big thing for me. What legacy am I leaving through my integrity, my behaviors? How am I able to even communicate honestly about sexuality and things? So again, no idea if I've answered your question there, but those are a lot of the things that come up for me when.
No, you did. Because I think, when my wife and I finally got through to this thing, to the point where it was looking like, we were going to have a marriage again. She mentioned something. She said, hey, would you, because one thing I said over and over again was, how did I not know about this? How did I not know this was a thing? How did I not know that this was as complicated as it was? How did I not know this was affecting over 200 million males just in the United States alone? It was just like, I couldn't believe, as somebody who reads a lot and is fairly educated, I like to say, how did I not know about this? And, so my wife brought up the idea of, well, would you ever do something about it to make it more known? And, my first reaction was, oh no, I can't have my daughter find out about this. I don't want anybody to know about this. But going back to your original connecting of the dots, I think, when I really was going to make recovery my own, when I do anything in my life, it's about impact. It's about what it does for another individual. A lot of successful people do rise above money, and that does end up not exciting them as much anymore. And so, I'm speaking to everyone, but especially to the high achieving population. When if you're wanting to connect those dots, I think that's one thing to look at is, one thing I consider such a miss was, the Tiger Woods issue, right? He went to treatment. He went to a very well-known treatment facility. And then it kind of turned into a joke. They made a South Park episode about it. He was on the news everywhere. And it was like, ah, ha, 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 he has a sex addiction. Of course, they would make up this problem so that he could clean his past and get away with it. And what a bummer that was, because that could have been an opportunity where arguably one of the world's biggest athletes was struggling with a problem that affects, conservatively 12% of the male population. So, to me, if, I say all that to say, if you're going to start making recovery your own, in my opinion, you do need to tap into something that is bigger than you, bigger than your marriage. It's really, you have to. There's a chapter in my book called "Your Recovery Is Not a Burden," and it's essentially my aha moment of, this is a self-mastery thing. I mean, this has nothing to do with sex. This has nothing to do with lying. This has to do with do I want to be somebody who lives out of integrity? Do I want to spend X portion of my existence here hiding something that I don't like, right? And I think if you really let that piece sink in and just kind of like ignore the sex addiction, compulsive sexual behavior stuff, if you just kind of put that out and just say, can I look at myself in the mirror spending my precious moments here on this earth? And if someone was to find out, because they typically do, what message would that send to my daughter, maybe another young boy who finds out that I'm doing this? Does that affect his life and now say, oh, if Roland did it, then I can too. So, a long way of saying, whatever it takes for you to tap into something that matters to you. I agree with you. Thanks for bringing that up, Chris. I haven't had anybody go that direction with it, but it's if you can find a way to make recovery a self-mastery practice for you, and I think the irony too is a lot of men in my group will 2x or 3x their income, which is it's quite interesting. It's, while we're not necessarily talking about business, it's surprising when you take back your humanity. Money is exchanged between two humans. And so if you're making the money that you're making with being 10% of yourself, imagine if these other individuals met a human being, how much more of those connections you would make, how many more of those contracts you would land, things like this. So the topic for today, we can kind of continue. We've been talking about it to some degree, is this idea of the washing machine. I've had a lot of men who, because my program is really designed for men who they've seen the CSAT, they've gone through, they're 6 months out of discovery. So a lot of the men have been through a lot of the motions. And then when they come into our recovery group, the goal is, okay, I need connection, like real connection with men I admire, I respect, men that I'm used to kind of being around. I call it the country club, essentially, of 12-step. But a lot of them, when I first meet them, they talk about this idea of being in the washing machine. It's like they recovery is coming along. Sobriety is either there or it's kind of starting to get there. They're getting longer lengths of it. But their wife knows they're not sober, and they know they're not sober, and it's like are recovered, if you will. And so it's this interesting place that they're in, where it's like, okay, I'm not necessarily an addict anymore, but I'm certainly not out of the woods. And they talk about this thing called the washing machine. It's usually like, okay, childhood trauma, talk about my trauma, and then wife says something, and now I have a different aspect of my trauma, talk about my trauma. And then my wife says something different and another aspect. And they say it feels like a washing machine. It's just another aspect of all of my traumas. And then we do our trauma stuff with it for 3 or 4 months. And then another thing comes up and I'm kind of back in it. And I've heard this described by Carnes and a bunch of other people around the fatigue that this brings on. And I've even heard there are people who come into my program who say, I think it might be easier to just get divorced and just start from scratch. I mean, that's the point they've gotten is I'm trying here, but I'm in this washing machine and it just seems to keep tumbling. Speak to that first before we dive into kind of the different aspects that you and I use with this new model. But speak to the washing machine a bit and why you believe that happens. And can you empathize with that?
Yes. Yes and yes. So I think, so first of all, I'm not I'm not a CSAT. So that means I can say what I want, which is nice. So sometimes I think with these things, there's a kind of funnel. There's like a kind of relatively thin lens through which we see a problem, and we can fall into that trap of then thinking everyone fits into that. So this cycle or washing machine kind of idea you're using of childhood trauma, we need to just dive in deeper and deeper and all these different aspects. Now, clearly, there's a huge amount of value in that and a huge amount of importance. If it's helping me either heal the wounds that are driving me or have historically driven me towards these sort of unproductive, unhealthy behaviors, or if it's at least just helping me in some way see the patterns in the present. So that is helpful. So just very clearly from the start, really, really important. However, I do think it can become a bit, the world of therapy in general, and again, I'm a therapist, the world of therapy in general, we can, I think as therapists, we can just love going into that stuff. Like, oh, great, we've got to talk about your past. We've got to talk about your family of origin. What was your parents' relationship like? What was the family home like? All important, but that actually sometimes can end up coming at the expense of dealing with the reality as it is now. What is the situation you are in now? And that's things like the partner's trauma, which you touched on, the reality of what happened, the reality of how they were harmed by the behaviors, the reality of who you are now in terms of integrity and intimacy and connection and all of those things. And so there is an element to me of, I guess I would call it diminishing returns, in that we never want to fall into the trap of avoiding the childhood stuff, because if we're really trying to avoid that childhood trauma, as a therapist, that tells me straight away that's probably kind of where we need to go, if it's the last thing you want to talk about. However, this idea of the fatigue, absolutely. I think there's a diminishing return where there's that point of, okay, I know all the things that are wrong with me. I know that this was messed up, or I know my dad could have done this more, or my mum could have done this more. But how can I actually deal with the present as it is right now, the here and now? That's my relationship with my wife and my recovery. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So I think there's a space for both, but the industry as a whole can get very stuck in that. Again, you're using that analogy of kind of washing machine, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said, because I think the way I look at it as, I don't necessarily look at it as this problem solution piece. To me, and that's why I kind of like the self-mastery aspect of recovery, because it's like you almost flip over a rock, if you will, and you see what's under there. And yeah, some of it's going to take some EMDR. Some of it might not, though. Some of it may be an area of interest that may actually require a little bit of talk therapy, or just discussions with your partner around to discover, hey, I saw this, I'm really interested in to get your thoughts on it. But to me, it's more, rather than a problem solution, it's almost like I think in the model that you and I were talking about, he draws this iceberg model, they call it, right? And the philosophy is that the childhood stuff's there. We can't ignore it. It does shape how we see ourselves. It does shape how we see the world. It does shape what's admirable and what's not, to what a man's supposed to do and what a man isn't supposed to do. So like, we can't, again, to your point, we can't ignore them. But I think rather than looking at it as a problem solution piece, it's almost as if, hey, I learned a bunch of this stuff, and I'm curious how it's affecting me. And I think the reason I think that is an unpopular viewpoint is it's a lifelong, what I just said is a lifelong process. It's like if you identify some narcissistic tendencies that you have on that spectrum, which I have a ton of them, I'm going to take care of my own needs, and I'm going to make sure my needs are met, because no one else is going to meet my needs, right? So has historically been a trauma, if you will, that I have had to navigate. And it served me really well in business, but I also, because I prioritize my needs, my attention, my happiness, there are people who've fallen under that. And so I guess it's what I'm saying is, it's rather than like a problem solution, okay, it's going to be gone, and then everything around that is going to be gone away. To me, I think more of an effective way is almost living with the reality that these are things that you do. And so are you kind of following there? It's like they don't necessarily go away. I think, to be honest with you, I think some of my narcissistic things that I have developed, gosh, it seems like it doesn't matter how much therapy I do or EMDR I do, or it seems like they kind of are there. I think the difference is I see them there. I see them feeding me the nonsense. And then I just kind of, as a functional adult, navigate their influence on my life. But are you following there? Do you have a similar kind of outlook? Is it almost like and I think it's unpopular because it is something that you're going to practice forever and ever. Now, I guess let me qualify that so I don't depress people. You get better and better and better at having it affect your present moment less. So I wouldn't say it's like it's always around in the same capacity. It gets to a point where I guess you could say you have, neural pathways that skip around this particular narcissistic way, and those become easier. But is that more almost what you were referring to before of, rather than looking at it as a washing machine, what if it's just data collection to function, better tomorrow, and then a little bit better the next day, and a little bit better the next day?
Yeah, and I think so. A really good way, or a way I like to try and think about that is, am I trying to be a different person, or am I trying to be the best version of myself, or the healthier version of myself? So we can think of all this kind of underwater stuff like complex trauma shaping, and all those patterns we're talking about. I think the link we're both kind of making there is, it's not so much about just constantly delving into that stuff and healing that stuff, whatever that means. It's more about understanding what patterns, or what habitual patterns of thinking, feeling, and relating did that leave me with that might be maladaptive, might be unhealthy. And how can I start to challenge those things and hold myself more accountable on those things? And in the DST model, there's this concept of, yes, complex trauma shaping. And then one of the analogies Dr. Minwalla uses is the cards you were dealt. So we were all dealt a deck of cards, if you like, or not a deck, but a hand of cards. That's who we are. So you've talked about narcissistic characteristics, for example. I'll have my things. Everyone listening to this or watching this will have their things. That's the hand we were dealt. So the question is, how can we best play that hand? So it's not an excuse by any means. It's not well, I can't help it. It's this is the reality of who I am. Again, how can I be the best version of that? And that's going to be a mixture of the way we were shaped, but also our biology, things like that. I often say to clients, I'll use a kind of pretty clear analogy, I guess, of, like you mentioned Tiger Woods earlier. I could train and train and train and become a better golfer. I'm never going to be Tiger Woods. It's just not going to happen. I could learn to run faster. I'm never going to be Usain Bolt. There's all of these kind of things of, I can be better, and I could work towards being the best version of myself in all these various characteristics. But there's going to be a limit to what I can do. And there's going to be things I can be great at and things I'm not going to be great at. And so I think on a more actual, dare I say, ethical note with this stuff as well, the problem is if we get obsessed with going into the past trauma in the mindset of, we can just heal all of this stuff, we just need to spend more time on this and heal this, I honestly think we're in danger of setting a kind of false expectation. And that's really dangerous, because I don't know if you've come across this concept in the recovery world that you might hear partners talk about, of hopium. Does that mean anything?
Yeah.
So I see it a lot with guys where I think actually they're working really hard, they're making real improvements, and there's areas where maybe there's deficits, where they're always likely to struggle. Again, to your point, you might always struggle with narcissistic tendencies from what you said. I hope that's okay for me to say.
I don't think it's that hard to pick up on. You can have one conversation with me, and you already know, okay, this guy struggles with compensating. So I don't think it's a mystery to anyone.
Okay. I'm not diagnosing, I'm reflecting. So the danger is that hopium point of, if you're telling, like if I was working with your wife and saying, oh, we just need to go into his childhood trauma more, and we just need to, and she's coming out of that expecting this reality where you're never going to struggle with those tendencies. I don't want to get myself in trouble, but the danger is there's an unethical element to that, of we're providing false hope, and everything to me in recovery, because sex addiction involves so much deception, manipulation, hiding, and all of those things. Everything about recovery should be honesty, authenticity. So yeah, hope that kind of
a spectrum. I called it, I just do like a quick little diagram sometimes to explain it to people, looking at recovery as a spectrum, right? On one end, you have the 100% addict mind, which is short-term gain, does not consider anyone else's needs or the ramifications of their actions. Is anybody that? No, I don't think so. I've never met somebody quite that delusional. I guess maybe in the darkest of times, someone might get there, but, and then you got 100% recovered at the other end, which is, I always think about the ramifications of my actions first. I always consider everyone else's, how this would affect everybody else. Does everybody always do that instantly with every decision? No. And so we're all landing somewhere in between those two and I think the goal is, yes, moving towards the recovered side of the spectrum every day. So yeah, we are, those decisions are being made in a really effective way. But I think here, and this is the unpopular piece that I think this is why a lot of people just don't want to talk about this, is the partners certainly don't want to hear it as a spectrum. They want it to be a light switch. The addict doesn't want it to hear as a spectrum. So I think it is really nice to hear about this idea that I am going to do some EMDR, and this thing that is plaguing me and has plagued me for decades will be healed. Again, I love that you said whatever that means, because they say that, and I've always just kind of accepted it as truth. But now that you say healed, it's like, I haven't read a book or heard from or any esteemed psychologist the concept that neuropath, that this could be healed. It's interesting you bring that up. The way that we deal with it. So we meet in our group. We meet weekly on Zoom, and then we meet. Then we have a daily app that we use. We can exchange video messages, whatever the flavor is on the weekly call. Typically, they don't have to, but typically that's kind of the flavor for the whole week on our video and voice exchange app. And what we do is we call attention to and call awareness to the thing that could be affecting our lives on a daily basis, in sex addiction, out of sex addiction, right? I think a lot of addicts, yes, sex is one way it manifests, but I think when you look at that, if you look at those the way they see themselves and the way they see the world, there's a lot of things that they're doing that are very similar when it comes to money, when it comes to posturing, walking into a networking event and posturing in some certain way, a car they drive, the outfit they put on. There's a lot of engineering going on, and sex is one way that some of that engineering can engage the brain processes. But it's to me, it's openly discussing. It's openly discussing, being very, very honest with other. To me, it's the most effective with other addicts. I think it's a hard conversation to have with your wife who's been betrayed. I think before she was betrayed, you might be able to have this conversation. I think once she's been betrayed, some of these things can be really difficult for her to hear, because now she thinks back and it's like, oh my gosh, you did that. You've done that since the day we met, and so it can be traumatic. So I think it's best handled with other men dealing with this. But revisiting your brain processes around attraction, around what's appropriate and not appropriate behavior. I think openly challenging some of these beliefs. And I guess what I'm getting at there is the saddest part that no one wants to hear is, to me at least, Chris, it seems almost like a trial and error thing. I just don't even know. I would love to put on some headphones and have the sound go back and forth and have this thing just go away. But at the same time, it's like, it almost seems like I have to screw it up, tell my guys about it, my therapist about it, and then come up with a superior way of handling it the next time. It's like, can we, I guess I'll ask you, can we, how do you preemptively change your brain patterns before the harm's been caused? I mean, it's like, that sounds so great on paper, but it's like, is that even possible? Because I know almost everything that I've done has been through seeing the harsh reality of my maladaptions.
Yeah, and that's a really big question, and that's a really painful question actually for the partners, and
and the addicts, I think, because I think we all want a perfect recovery.
Absolutely. But I'm thinking, so when I say for the partners, that it raises that question sometimes of, if I'd never discovered you, would you have ever gone into recovery? Would you have ever changed? And that kind of question of, does it almost take the explosion? Does it take the car crash for the guy And that's almost right back to the first point. That's the
Mhm.
external versus internal motivation piece. What I have found with probably quite a lot, probably the vast majority of the guys I work with, is through kind of almost justification, rationalization, what I'd call almost self-gaslighting. Often convinced ourselves what I'm doing isn't that bad, or it isn't really hurting people, or other people do it worse, or whatever it might be. Or quite frankly, there might just be a level of entitlement of I deserve this. So, I mean, in answer to your question, some people might muster up that internal motivation without having to have experienced that kind of car crash first. But unfortunately, the statistics I see just of clients I work with, my anecdotal experience would tell me that sadly, that is not very often the case. It is going to take the car crash in order to see the change. And because it's so hard to kind of rewire the brain, it's going to take a lot of motivation to do it. So a lot of people, especially if it's, we're kind of getting into some important kind of technical areas, if you like, now, of like entitlement versus addiction. One of the diagnostic criteria of sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior disorder is that I've tried to stop
and I can't
multiple times and haven't been able to. So I've had a demonstrated lack of control. So I would say if that's the case, it would demonstrate that there wasn't enough internal motivation. There certainly probably wasn't enough internal motivation to try and stop and bring it into the light and tell people that I was struggling. And if there was no attempts to stop, that kind of raises the big ugly word of entitlement. Like if I never tried to stop it, that's maybe a different story. But either way, I think we kind of come to the same conclusion that it often does take that car crash. I can't think of a better metaphor to facilitate the change, unfortunately, because when that happens, we're not the only people impacted by the crash.
And it's so critical to, because I knew, one of my challenges when this happened to me was, first couple months you're in shock, but then after that it was like, started realizing, man, this thing has its fingers in all sorts of areas of my life. I mean, there's a bunch of things that I do that are not sexual acting out that I do for attention, validation, approval, sexually, non-sexually. I mean, I just started realizing, and I felt entitled to it. Minwalla, he has this cool analogy of like the feeding tubes, right? I don't know if do you see the picture that he, people using these other individuals as feeding tubes to satisfy these various needs. And I love, I think for the high achiever, this is a cool direction to go, because I think this would be a topic for discussion, because I think, the concept that is sold quite often is you've had a traumatic childhood. This now has created you to have a dysregulating reality, and you need to do these addictive things to regulate the reality. And so the treatment is get rid of the trauma that's causing this dysregulation, and then you will be healed. I think I think that I have seen that work with people. I think for my population, they are very successful. A lot of them have a lot of friends, a lot of esteem, a lot of meaning with their career, accomplishment. They've won awards. They have beautiful families. A lot of them are fortunate enough to have the means and time off to be due. So I would say when this concept is sold to them, they can try to get around it, because, underneath a lot of high achievers, I would say 99 out of 100 high achievers, underneath it is some of the lowest self-esteem, inadequacy. I am not enough the way I am. If I never changed and accomplished more, that would be a shameful. My life would have no meaning, right? So that's underneath of it, and then all the success is on top. And I would say that's almost every male in my group. You would never know that they felt that way, but the only reason they built that resume was to make sure that if anyone ever saw the other one, they would have a laundry list of things to say, oh, that one, that's not me. Look at all this, right? You've got the wrong guy. But I think that the challenge is they have a really hard time getting sold on this concept that they are dysregulated, because a lot of them have a lot of healthy regulation practices, lots of time with the kids, hobbies, vacations, and then they're acting out. And so I think it's challenging in the beginning to try to rally their head around, okay, yes, maybe underneath all this is a nonstop pressure of, I need to be more than I am. I need to buy more, have more, do more, and then I'll be enough. And don't get me wrong, that is a very, that type of pressure can be very, very dysregulating. But I do think that sale is a little harder for a lot of them, because at least in my experience, when they hear that, they don't necessarily resonate with the idea that they are kind of dysregulated throughout the day and they're using the sexual acting out as a release, because a lot of them, the frequency is really, Chris, it's really random. It's just, a night they can't sleep. It's like this one time on this one, they might go 2 months with, very little to nothing. But then they got this trip coming up, and they've known it was coming up, and, they might have prearranged some things. But I think that's a huge issue that kind of brings on this washing machine, is they're almost hunting for and starting to fabricate stories of dysregulation, because it's like, I don't know if I'm actually doing this anymore, right? And you go to meetings and everyone's all dysregulated and pissed off, and it's just like, I'm not that pissed off. I enjoy my career. My wife and I are, so I'd love to kind of transition towards that, because I do think that brings on a lot of this washing machine is, okay, why was I dysregulated when that happened? And it's like, even though a lot of their body is saying, I really wasn't, honestly, I was a really great day. I mean, that whole day was great. And then I acted out that night. Right.
Yes. And then that's when I'm thinking of a recent client, actually, who was sharing that with me, that he was part of a men's recovery group. And they were doing this, analyzing your childhood and your parents and stuff. And he was sharing with me that he felt really, really bad afterwards, because he had put something negative about his dad down, because it was like, well, that's what everyone else is doing. And he felt so pressured, like, okay, well, I guess he did this. And then he was saying, actually, I felt really guilty afterwards, because it was like, I don't think he did. I think I had a really good dad. And he was almost like in the group feeling ashamed of not having a childhood wound there that he could name. So I think that's probably one of the offshoots of what we're talking about. And so I think, again, to my point, we are nearly all, well, I would say all of us are going to have complex trauma shaping in different things. But that is, again, why I think it's important we're dealing with reality as it is. And if the reality of the day was, I acted out, I slipped up, but I had a great day. I was really connected to my wife. Things were good. I just got bored and I acted out. Well, okay, let's explore what really happened. Let's not try and, again, I mentioned about like the funnel or the tunnel vision earlier. Let's not say, okay, my book tells me that means that you were dysregulated. So what was the dysregulation? And I think in the models, again, that you and I have talked about, we can look at our complex trauma shaping story. So the slight difference with that is, which I imagine will resonate a lot more with some of the guys watching this based on what you've said, is rather than just look for these big specific things that happened and traumas, it's more, given the patterns of my life, my childhood, my adolescence, how over time was I shaped to think and feel and relate, and to relate to myself and to view myself and all of these things. I think that has a much bigger impact than, the one-off big things that might have happened that we sometimes obsess on. And then you've also got the complex gender shaping and complex trauma shaping. You mentioned that image of like the feeding tubes and all of these perceived successes being the things that are maybe feeding my ego or feeding my self-worth. That's very, very relevant to secret sexual basements or addictions or whatever we're going to, whatever phrase we're going to use. I think that, well, certainly from my perspective, those things have a much bigger impact, because again, they are the things that relate in the patterns of how we think and feel in the moment. So in the moment, that slip, that acting out might have been as simple as I felt like doing it because I was bored, so I did it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, that sounds like an entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
Let's explore, is that a healthy entitlement or an
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy one? Where did that entitlement develop from? What patterns have led to that? That might be the story. There might
Mm-hmm.
not be this big other thing that was going on, to your point.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So,
the irony of it all too is it's like, you know, just because we're not talking about emotional dysregulation, you know, and again, I don't even like the word trauma because it's just been very, you know, the second you hear the word, everyone's conclusions are just so unhelpful. You know, trauma can be your idol, your mentor, inviting you into his office and being like, man, look at this trade I did today. Like, see that number? So I bought it at this number. That if that's a 10-year-old boy who really looks up to this individual, and this guy is taking this moment to you know, brag about how much money, and then, you know, he minimizes the window and he goes, oh, and check this out, and it's a car. And he's showing him, hey, I'm going to take all this money that I just bought, I'm going to buy this car, it's been on my bucket list for a while. The kid leaves the office. You know, a lot of people wouldn't call that a trauma. These are the types of things that happened to me that made me the way that I was. Now, why was that traumatic? Because I did not look up to my father. I did not want to be him. He wasn't a bad father. I just didn't admire him. And he spent his entire life telling me, don't be like him. And so my own father said, whatever you do, don't grow up like me. So I am obviously surveying the society of, okay, if I can't be my dad, who am I going to be then? And this guy, you know, he owns all sorts of stuff. Everyone, his Christmas parties were huge, seemed to be really liked, and he seemed happy. And so I idolized him and other people like him. You know, and so I think the danger of the word trauma always being this adverse effect, that adversely affected me. Even though, again, he was, you know, I don't know what his intentions of kind of exposing me to that was, but I think I think that the challenge, I think, with trauma is that we always think back to the moment itself being traumatic. And I think that was an adverse developmental experience. I just didn't know that it was going to negatively affect me until a decade or two later. And so I do want to bring that up for everybody listening. A trauma can be as simple as, oh, a guy just saying, oh, she's going to choose him over him because that guy has more money. I mean, it can be a simple sentence said to you at an age where you are trying to learn how the world works, and that can adversely affect your life until it causes a problem, yeah. Right? And I think you know, I don't know if you have a different outlook on that, but to me, the thing that finally, there's a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, and she says, in her opinion, the big breakthrough is when you get over the delusion that you had a perfect childhood. And I think the thing that was kind of my breakthrough there was the definition of a perfect childhood does not mean that you weren't physically abused, sexually abused, cussed at, malnourished, whatever. The delusion is, oh, nothing happened wrong with me. I didn't learn anything. I didn't learn anything adverse. And so I shouldn't have to change any, you know, I shouldn't have to change. I shouldn't be in this position. But again, those examples that I just said, you know, that was my life. I didn't have anything horribly awful. It was just by the time I was 10, there was a lot I had to do. There was a lot of money I had to do. There was a lot of houses I needed to buy. There was a lot of cars I needed to buy, a lot of girls that I needed to like me. And so by the time I'm 10, you know, the list of the things that I needed to live a fulfilling life was so long that it just, you know, eventually it turned me into, you know, my sex addiction. That's just one of many issues that I had. But you know, do you have a different analogy when you're trying to sell the concept of trauma? I just hate that word, but you know, because that's, I think, a lot of successful people, they don't have a lot of bad stories, yet your parents saying, oh, I can't wait for you to go to Harvard when the kid's 9. I mean, that's gonna traumatize the kid. I would never dream of saying something like that to my daughter, and rob her of all these other opportunities that might bring her joy had she pursued them instead.
Yeah. So I use the phrase complex trauma shaping, and the shaping is the important word. So it's not like the impact of this trauma or that trauma. It's the shaping over time. So the analogy or the metaphor, if you like, is drops of water on a rock.
Yeah.
So rather than thinking of the rock being hit with a sledgehammer and breaking in half, which we might typically think of in terms of trauma, that big thing that happened to me. It's that, like you're saying, it's those messages you were given, and you were given it over time, more and more. It might even in, the media, or, watching James Bond movies over and over again, and how that's portrayed. And that's another drop of water on that rock. And the idea of like with erosion, that the no individual drop makes much impact. So to your language, doesn't have an adverse event necessarily, but over time they shape the rock. And in this metaphor, the rock is my psyche, my personality. So it is shaped by all of that messaging. So to your point, like some of the examples I would use would be, let's say you have parents that all throughout your life would tell you, maybe you did well at school, and it was constantly, we're so proud of how well you're doing at school. It's great that you do so well. Brilliant, positive, wonderful, lovely. Maybe over time that puts a hell of a lot of pressure on you to be doing well, and thinking and tying my value and the esteem my parents hold for me to how well I'm doing and to behaving well. So now I start struggling with something like, I don't know, sex addiction, or, acting out in some way. The last thing I want to do is tell anybody, because my self-worth is so tied to being the guy that does well. So, I mean, that in itself is a simple example, but it's a good one of something that didn't have an adverse event tied to it, but perhaps played a direct part to the development of my secret sexual basement. So yeah, this idea of complex trauma shaping, when I came across it, was kind of a game changer for me, because I think I was stuck in that funnel that we've been talking about of, okay, dysregulation, trauma, what was going on. And when I started seeing things through the lens of complex trauma shaping rather than, capital T trauma, massively changed everything.
Oh, it is. It's to get to our house that we're staying here right now. My wife and I drive past a strip to the right and the left of the freeway of just strip clubs. They're just all, for whatever reason, they're all in the same area. And it's I think about it every single time when I drive by. I just think, if this is here openly advertised, I even saw an advertising for it on television the other day. When you're watching TV on the cloud, they don't have to comply to the same rules that the TV the people do who are on the broadcasting channels. But you do. It's you got to think about that. Can you really go all in on your recovery for you? Connect those dots like you were discovering at the beginning, if the whole time you're banking this little idea of, well, everybody else can, but now I can't because I got caught. I mean, and that is, a lot of guys would say, oh, no, that's not me. I would stop and really consider that. I mean, if what they say, 1 in 4 internet searches are pornographic in nature. The effect of the collective consciousness, I think, is more powerful than everyone says. When everyone's objectifying this particular cheerleader or this particular actress, it does start to seem less egregious when everyone, women included, are objectifying her. It now seems, it seems like, okay, well, if everyone is, and I think that's, the question I always ask the guys in the group is, just because everyone's doing it, does that mean it's right? Because I think if that was your daughter, I don't think you would have the same grace. I think you would. I think you would. At least for me, I wish that they would see something more in her than her appearance, and it would bother me that is why she was famous, because there's a lot more to her that I think is special, and this is the only reason that she's known is her appearance. And the main reason I would be sad by that is, what impact is that having on her? I think a little short example that I'll give everybody, to go right off the one that you just said in terms of dripping on the rock. I was just with my daughter day before yesterday, and she was going to a party, and she changed, and it was a new outfit, and she ran into the room or in the doorway and did she's 5, she struck a little pose. And I said, "Oh wow, you're so beautiful. You look so pretty. I love your dress." And it's funny. She went back to her room, and I thought to myself, I said, did I just negatively affect her? In the same way that parents, if the only time that you give them the 10 out of 10 level of praise is when you're excelling scholastically, or when you win, and they don't give you that when you lose. They don't give you that for being you, for having your unique thoughts. They don't give you that for how you treated your younger brother, older sister, and you're only getting praise for those moments. That does traumatize a child, because it's like, okay, well, if I really want their attention, I need to do hard things as often as possible and excel in them. And, I was thinking about that. I was like, I'm going to make sure I tell her that she's pretty when she's in her pajamas as well. And I'm going to say it to her trickled out throughout the day, because I thought about that moment. I thought, that's why she came in. She struck her little pose. She had her little 5-year-old brain has already figured out that her father would probably find this little get up very attractive. And I just thought to myself, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of that drip, drip, drip. You have daughters. I'm sure you see similar things. It's just, how nice would it be if she put it on the outfit and knew that I thought she was pretty both times and didn't strike that pose, right? She knew inherently my dad finds me pretty no matter what I'm wearing. And, I hope that example, means things to other people, not just me with my daughter, but that hit me really hard. Man, it is hard to parent. It is hard to parent and have this not affect. It's hard for me to not do all the things that were done to me, because my parents did. If they hate hearing the stuff that they did to me, because they did not mean to do that to me. And in a sense, that's a micro example of something not that unsimilar than what was done to me.
And I think when you have your eyes open to this stuff, it is hard not to then almost initially have this kind of paralysis of like, crap, what am I doing to my kids? Like, it's that idea. How are they being complex trauma shaped, or complex gender shaped, or complex sexuality shaped? Because that's what you're talking about, particularly with girls. It's like, am I giving them that message that you will receive affirmation from males when you look this way? What a toxic message that is not at all what we're wanting to communicate. But are we so entrenched in that thinking that we're doing it without even realizing? What I would just say as an encouragement is, I remember as part of my training, my therapeutic training, we all went through that process as a class. We all hit that point of like, crap, we're now realizing how much we're messing up our kids. And I remember the tutor saying, first of all, the goal is not to be a perfect parent, it's to be a good enough parent. And actually, if you are worried about how you might mess your child up, you're probably on the right path to being a good parent. It's the people who aren't worried about what they're doing to their kids that more of the problem. So I don't know if that encourages you, but I think there's a lot of
no. I've got grace there, because I have the same outlook. The fact that that's even on my radar. Because here's the thing: when she's older, maybe 9, 10, 11, 12, I might have this conversation with her, and I say, hey, I know I told you look beautiful, and you really do, but you look. I want you to know, I really find you, and I'll have this conversation with her. And I think that's the thing I would say too, to a lot of parents who have some, remorse around a lot of that stuff. I would say it's never too late to have even if you have adult children, I don't think it's ever too late to have a conversation about your worldview at the time, and expressing some hey, I used to see things this way, and now I see them this way. I don't think it's ever too late to do that, because I do, whether you're going to get the thing back from them, it never hurts to say it out loud, to call attention to that, because I wouldn't underestimate the healing that can have on the other individual, when they start to realize, okay, my parents do acknowledge that pushing me scholastically probably wasn't the best thing. So Chris, how can people work with you? I know you're overseas. Can someone in the United States work with you, or is it only going to be our listeners who are in the UK?
So yeah, I run my practice within the UK. So it's chrisjonestherapy.co.uk. So yeah, there's some restriction there in that. So I work as a coach and as a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a therapist, I can work with people in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I can also work with people in Australia, New Zealand, various parts of Europe. It's the US that's the problem. Very, very highly regulated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do some coaching.
Yep.
I only do a limited amount of hours, but I do have some coaching available for people in the US. I work pretty exclusively from the DST model, which again, we've mentioned a few times, the deceptive sexuality trauma model. And what I'm actually working on right now, my sort of primary project right now, is the model, and you'll be aware of this, has a lot in it. It's lots of different terms, lots of concepts like the complex trauma shaping, complex gender shaping, some of these things I've mentioned. And so I'm putting together a pretty in-depth psychoeducational series for people who are interested in the model, but aren't really able to connect with therapists trained in the model because there's such a lack of supply right now. So yeah, there's going to be various options for people that want to engage in the model in some way, and I'm more than open to talking to people about that if they're interested.
Yeah. Do they have what's the best way to get on some sort of wait list for that? Is there do you have an email contact form on the website if somebody was interested in getting that when it comes out?
Yeah, that's right. So there's it would be just visit the website. You can get my email or contact form through there, and just let me know. And as I said, I'm there's a few different options, but I'm open to just hearing from people and talking to them about it, because I'm personally very excited about this model, this way of working, this kind of slightly unique way of approaching things. So I'd love to connect with people.
Yeah, me too. No, I'm happy to hear that you're doing that you're planning to do that, because it's been very short supply for a lot of variety of reasons. And unfortunately, I do think that the reason that a lot of this approach, I think the short supply of this approach is part of the reason why we see such a low recovery rate in this particular addiction. I think the recovery rate speaks for itself. I think looking at this with too narrow of a view, there will be people who recover, and then there will be people outside of that statistic who there's just a few things there that they're better than they were in the beginning, but then the sad reality with this addiction is partners don't, they forgave you once, twice is a different story. That's for sure. So I'm really glad you're working on this, because I think it's a very enlightening thing, and I think it makes a huge difference for the men who are at this stage of their recovery. So Chris, this was awesome, man. I really appreciate your time, and I hope this isn't the last time. This was a fun conversation.